time for our next Awareness Monday. And today's topic is taking up your space and setting boundaries. And I just want to, in the beginning, spend some time and just reflect a little bit upon my last weekend when we had our women's spring retreat at Waitatuna Retreat Center near Reglan, which is a beautiful space, a beautiful location. And yeah, 21 women coming together and celebrating femininity, but also tapping into those topics of taking up space, setting energetic, but also verbal boundaries, and tuning in with their own hearts, with their own needs, in order to be able to set boundaries. So over the course of the last weekend at the Women's Spring Retreat, boundaries and taking up, our own space was quite a pivotal topic for the women, for all of us. So this topic, setting boundaries, taking up space, creating space within ourselves, is a very important topic, I feel. Simply because so many of us don't really feel confident enough, or strong enough, or good enough to really set boundaries. And the other thing is, so many of us don't really know or have a feeling for where our boundaries are and what our boundaries are. And now in the next 20 minutes or so, I just want to talk a little bit about that, about that difficulty of setting boundaries, what boundaries actually are, and how we can reclaim our space, and not only as women but as human beings. So we all know that situation, when we start feeling resentful, or perhaps also even angry, or at someone for not having respected us or acknowledged us. And sometimes we don't even know why we're feeling angry and resentful towards other people, and perhaps also towards ourselves. And we tend to go into this blaming mode. It's because this person didn't say hello, or this person didn't listen to what I was saying. Or this person didn't respect my time, or me, as a person. So, and it's easy to go, for all of us, and we all do that at times. It's easy for us to go into blaming mode and blame the other person, everything that is external, not inside of us. But in the end of the day, all this anger and resentment is within us. We carry it, and it stays there. If we keep looking for reasons in the external world, this resentment and anger will stay with us, because we're kind of like hanging on to it. We're really, we're attaching to it. And oftentimes, if we go on a little bit of a journey as to why am I so angry and resentful with my partner, with my mother, with my kids, with my work colleagues, whatever context it is, oftentimes the cause, the actual cause of our feelings, of our anger or resentment, is because we actually haven't acknowledged our own limits, our own space, and our own boundaries. And that's so quick to do, that is so easy, that we just override. It's it just takes a moment of not being present and aware, or just, going into a default pattern of not really um, listening to our body cues, for example. And our body is such a great source of wisdom, and a great source of information as well when it comes to boundaries, because our limits and boundaries are being communicated through our bodies. We all know those, those figure of speech is like, my gut feeling said yes, or my gut feeling said no to something, or I had this tight throat, like a knot in my throat when this person talked to me, um, or when I was being asked to do something, I felt my stomach tightening, or not in my stomach even. So, when we go back to the actual situation and the root cause of things, it's oftentimes that we actually already got the answers from our own body, from our own inner wisdom system, but in a way chose to not listen to it. And to us, it often doesn't seem like we chose not to listen. We just feel like we didn't. There was no information, there was no message or signal. But digging deeper, we always will find that there was a hint, a body cue, a clear yes or a clear no from our body as to, you know, what was happening in that situation, and if we should have said yes or no, for example, or say, hey, you don't speak to me like that. So all this resentment and anger that, sometimes comes up, and we then tend to switch into blaming mode, oftentimes has actually, the real cause of us not having been sensitive with ourselves and caring. So that's really a first step that I always explore with with the people I work with in session. So what is your awareness around your boundaries and what they are, and also what is your awareness around what type of boundaries, you said, what type of boundary setter you are, so to speak. So just want to talk a little bit about that, because there are different types of personal boundaries and how to set them, and most of us are a mix of these types, but we definitely have tendencies or preferences. So, and having some awareness around that can help us to to see, okay, where do I need more attention? What needs to be reinforced or built up within me, so that I'm able to take my space more and set boundaries in a healthier and, for me, more empowering, beneficial way. So there are, you could kind of like say that there are three main categories of how to setting boundaries. That's one, having rigid boundaries. Two, having porous or permeable boundaries. And a third category is healthy boundaries. So with rigid boundaries, obviously, there would be behavior or people who have, a very tight protection net around them, and probably are more inclined to say no to other people than to say yes. And they tend to say no to other people before they can be rejected or get rejected. Very unlikely for, people with rigid boundaries to ask for help, because it's that fear again of, I might get rejected, so before I do get rejected, I just don't ask straight away. People with rigid boundaries are very, very protective of their own personal information, and rather keep it on the surface. So oftentimes there is a fear of intimacy going along with that, and a fear of close relationships. So and with those, with setting very rigid, unflexible boundaries, it's kind of like an avoidance mechanism, to not get too close. And then, with the risk of being rejected later on. They may seem detached and, somewhat reserved. And that can even happen within romantic relationships. So that's people with rigid boundaries, who, tend to say no more often than yes, and keep their very safe distance from other people, and avoid too much closeness, too much intimacy, too much sharing of their innermost personal secrets or life. Then we have the people who tend to be more open with their boundaries, or even porous with their boundaries. So that's kind of like the opposite of the rigid boundaries. If you have porous boundaries, you probably tend to overshare information and then afterwards regretting it, because it may backfire. Because you may share information that you, in hindsight and upon reflection, feel like you should not have shared. These would also be people who have difficulty saying no, even though they don't want to do whatever the inquiry is. That can be work-related or in your personal life. They tend to also be over-invested in the problems of others. So it's kind of like, what comes to mind is the people pleasers. They want to please, they want to fix, they really truly from their hearts, it's coming from their hearts oftentimes. They truly want to help and support and fix, but tend to forget to actually also focus, to take themselves into consideration and into the equation. They're over-invested in other people's problems and overly focusing on what other people do, without actually having on the radar their own needs and space and limits. They can be very dependent on other people's opinions. So there is a certain fear of judgment, and therefore also tend to accept abuse or disrespect from others. When they're being, treated in a not okay way, instead of actually stepping up and saying, hey, there's a boundary here. That's not okay to talk to me like that. They rather tend to just go along with it, with disrespect or even abuse. And like I said in the beginning, that all comes down to a fear of rejection. So as opposed to the rigid boundary maker who much sooner says no. So, rejecting first before being rejected. The person with the porous boundaries tends to say yes much, much more out of the fear of being rejected when they're not complying with others. And then the third category are the healthy boundaries. So what would that mean? How would that look? How does that feel? How does that look like to set healthy boundaries? A person who's capable of setting healthy boundaries is also at the same time capable to value their own opinion and to not compromise their own values and opinions for others out of a fear of rejection. So, and that requires a certain knowledge, an awareness of what are my values, what is it that truly, really matters to me in terms of relationships, in terms of acknowledgement. How do I want to be acknowledged and respected? What does disrespect mean for me, for example? What pushes my buttons and why? So that's a journey of exploration. What are my values and opinions about life and the world? A person with healthy boundaries also shares information in an appropriate way. So there's not that, that swinging between either over or under sharing. And feels good with, and ends up after the conversation, feels good with what they have shared and contributed to the conversation. Healthy boundary setters know their personal wants, their needs, their likes and dislikes, and they also feel confident and comfortable in communicating them. So again, that comes back to the values, needs, my wants, my likes. Do I actually know what I really want and like? And oftentimes when we tend more to be the porous, that category, porous boundaries or rigid, we don't really connect and tune in with our true needs and boundaries in any given moment, because we are overly focused and invested in what the other person does. So it's harder for us to actually reflect and integrate our own experience into the situation. And also people with healthy boundaries are more likely to be accepting of others saying no to them, because they don't take it personal. They don't take it as a rejection or as a form of ignorance, being ignored by others. So oftentimes, like I said before, we have, all of us have tendencies, and in the end of the day, these categories, especially the rigid and the porous boundaries, they are coping mechanisms. Yeah, I've already tapped into that. They're coping mechanisms for not being hurt by rejection. And that applies to both the rigid and the porous boundaries. It's that fear, and oftentimes we can swing and sway between both categories. So And that's a very common thing that happens after, for example, having been too open and too much yes, and too much information and oversharing and giving ourselves to the world. We might end up feeling we're not getting back the same effort that we have invested, and end up feeling very resentful and angry, and perhaps also treated unfairly. And then we might end up being like, no, that's it, I'm not going to give myself away ever again, and we sway into the other extreme, the rigid boundaries, as a form of almost like sulking, yeah, as a form of punishment. I'm going to punish the other person. But again, these these feelings, they stick with us. So we're not actually really punishing the other person. Who we punish is ourselves with this, swaying back and forward between those two categories, rigid and porous boundaries. So taking up our own space and really tapping into an empowered and healthy way of setting boundaries means I really need to create space to become clear about my wants, about my needs, about my values. And I need to create space to really practice that, and that starts within yourself. It's always easier to start doing these things, these realizations, first and foremost within yourself, and then expand that into the relationships you have. Because we all know, when we are in relation with someone else, when we have a conversation, or even a conflict, it's not so easy to actually stay focused and centered always with what's going on in our bodies and what's going on with our needs and what we want. Yeah, because we're in a conflict situation, we oftentimes are being thrown off center, and then the fight-flight response is activated, and that makes it hard to stay focused and centered and be aligned with what we truly are, what we truly want. So that's why this topic of boundaries is something, is an exploration and a reflection process that starts within, and it has a lot to do with awareness around my authentic self, my true needs, my limits, my capacity, my emotional capacity, my physical capacity, my mental capacity. Yeah, so, and that changes. That can change on a daily basis, what I have available to give. So taking up my space and feeling empowered, feeling powerful and empowered, means to create and carve out pathways that help me, pathways as in little rituals that help me to know what's my capacity today, what do I really have to give today. And then from there, I can start relating and responding to the world around me. But not the other way around, because if we keep doing it the other way around, we end up feeling insecure because we don't really know. We have skipped that tuning in and checking in process, and we're just reacting to the world. And reaction means we're defaulting. We're defaulting back into, whatever our pattern is, either the rigid or the porous, or a mix of both. So, and then we end up feeling angry or resentful and disempowered, basically. And yeah, in order to break that cycle, really tuning into what my wants are, what my needs are, what my values are, and what it means to create a space within myself to explore that. And that will be a journey, that is a process, that is a practice, and that's not an outcome that will be ticked after a certain time of tuning in with that. And I want to mention one more thing at the end. Oftentimes we take on other people's energy, and that's a normal thing. That's not something that makes you a weak person, or it's not something that you do wrong. It's just what happens because we are very sensitive and intuitive beings, and whether we realize that at a conscious level or it's more happening on a subconscious level, it is happening. These energetic transactions are happening, and especially when we are being very sensitive and empathetic, and have, especially when we do have the tendency to be over invested in other people's lives, coming from our big hearts of wanting to help, we easily pick up other people's energies, and that makes it harder for us to stay tuned in and centered with our own energy, with our own feelings, with our own capacity. So in addition to what I said before, another tool that really can help to stay centered and clear, and to practice setting healthy boundaries more and more and more in your daily routine, means to set energetic boundaries, to clear the energy that actually isn't yours, all that stuff that you may have taken on from other people, because you're so sensitive, you're so perceptive to take it on, requires for us the skill to also discharge that again from our system, basically detox it, if you will. And again, that means, okay, we need to tap into a process of distinction. What is mine and what isn't mine? And that's not always so easy to do when we're not used to doing that, because we might have all these feelings within us, and heaps of things are happening over the course of a day. So it's not so easy, to kind of like distinguish all this clutter and what is really ours. And if you, as you listen to that, realize, well, actually, I don't really know. I don't really have a good understanding or feeling or awareness of what is mine and what isn't mine in terms of the energy that I'm taking on, then this might be also a hint for you to look at that, and to get a better feeling for what is mine and what needs to be detoxed out of my system, discharged from my system, so that I, again, taking up my space, so that I take up my space, so that I'm able again to take up space. I can only do that when I create space within myself. It's the same like when we're doing our spring tidy up, or cleaning our house, decluttering. If we're losing overview of what's in our wardrobe, for example, because there's so much clothes in there, it's hard to keep that overview of what's really needed and beneficial and what is not. And the same applies to energy, and the energetic transactions that we are being exposed every day in our human experience. And again, that is not a bad thing. It is that's normal, because we are energetic beings. But it just requires tools um, so that we can discharge what got too much in us. Yeah, so going forward from here, check in with yourself. A beautiful way to embark on this topic and to delve deeper into this topic, setting boundaries in a healthy way, taking up your spaces, um, asking yourself questions. What's my tendency? Do I have rigid boundaries? Do I tend to set more porous boundaries or healthy boundaries? And another question that is very pivotal to ask yourself is, what is my understanding of my needs, my capacity, my values, and my wants? Do I have a good understanding of that in different aspects and areas? Yeah, emotional needs, physical needs, mental needs, and what is my energetic capacity on a day-to-day basis, and what of these energies are not mine? What can I actually just let go, discharge, and leave behind me? That's where it actually starts to enable yourself to set more healthy boundaries in an easeful and also graceful way. Yeah, so as always, you have the opportunity to ask questions around that topic, setting boundaries and taking up your space. And until Wednesday this week, you have the opportunity to just send all sorts of questions that you have around this topic. And then over the course of this week, after the Wednesday, um, I will be answering your questions around that topic. And yeah, hope you got something out of this topic today. And let me know how you're going. And all the best to you. Enjoy this evening and stay connected with your needs and values and your beautiful heart. Thank you so much.